the final talk is probably one of the most fascinating ones because I'm biased because my sister is a medical faculty at Stanford, but healthcare is one of the very interesting topical areas for vision and machine learning. There are a lot of data privacy issues, a lot of systemic barriers, but it's one of the most challenging fields. So our next speaker is Sadie Zeller. She's the Global Market Manager for Clinical Products at our Microscan system up in Washington. She's been involved in medical devices and life sciences for the last 15 years. So she'll be talking about the challenges you face in applying imaging and vision in the medical device technology.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. As mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about healthcare industry and some of the vision applications that can be used within the life sciences space, some stuff that we do as well as others, give you an idea of how vision can help automate labs and others. So I'll give you a little overview of Microscan. Many of you probably don't know who we are, to let you know what we do and who we are. Talk about this market, because it's also another market that we haven't really talked about the last couple of days, so you understand what their needs are. Then I'll talk about the evolution of vision within this space and how it's really, a lot of the stuff we've learned here, how it's really become possible to do vision in this area. Talk about some key challenges and some solutions we've found that are hopefully applicable across industries, and then wrap up with some lessons learned. Microscan has been around for over 35 years. We started in the barcode reading space in barcode scanners, and we've evolved as the technology and the needs of our customers have evolved to doing machine vision and other applications within barcode and barcode verification. A large part of our business is in industrial automation, but we have a segment of our business, which I lead, which supports the life sciences and that market. Very similar needs with the throughput, needing higher throughput, but a unique situation here is the need for automation to reduce errors that humans make within the life science space. So, the market in question that we typically work with is called the in vitro diagnostics or IVD market. It's a subset of medical devices, and really that's the group that uses means to diagnose or detect diseases or medical conditions. They may use samples such as blood or urine. They may be checking your genes to see if you have a defect, inherited or mutated, and a lot of different techniques such as taking big instruments down to a single point of care handheld that you can use out in rural villages to test for diseases and other such. So a wide range of tests and instruments that are used here. And this sort of shows how big this market is. This graph gives estimates from 2022. It shows market share against sales growth. And the IVD market, you can see, is the biggest one. It's the purple one. It's approximately a $50 billion market right now. And it's expected to grow at greater than 5% year over year for at least the next 5 years. A big push of this is continued double-digit growth in China as that healthcare space continues to mature, but it's also a lot to do with what's going on with the genetics situation, doing the point-of-care testing and others that are really driving this growth. Automation has been in the life sciences industry for many, many years. There's been quite a bit of standards developed around this, defining how you can use automation, as well as the technical advances that we've all seen over the years have allowed this to be an area of rapid adoption. I mentioned high throughput. This being able to do more in a shorter period of time, getting results back to the patients more quickly for care is very important. You can think of a lab technician, let's say they can do a manual test 1 every 2 minutes, so you've got 30 an hour. You now have systems that can do 150, 300, 1,000, 3,000 samples per hour they promote in their specs. So that's a huge increase in throughput and efficiency. That allows the lab techs to be working on more complex problems and situations where they're needed. I also mentioned reducing error rates. The studies show that a human may make an error every 1 in 300 test cases. They may do it in correct process as they're doing some testing, or it may just be as simple as transposing data from one situation to another. You add automation in, especially automation done correctly, and you can drastically reduce the errors that are occurring. And finally, once you start to do automation, you can streamline and standardize tests in the whole chain. You can send results up to the healthcare records information system. You can control robotics and automation further down the chain and tell them what they should be doing next based on your results. You can sort of manage the whole ecosystem. So this market, as I mentioned, and as Microscan started out, was mainly doing barcode reading. All of your blood samples, all of your records always have a barcode on them. It's been many years that they've had a barcode. But as technology, performance has improved, ease of use has improved, and size and price have gone down, you're really starting to see this market go towards vision applications. Instead of doing PC-based machine vision, you can now do vision embedded on a smart camera, and that camera can go right into the instrument itself and do vision embedded within the medical devices themselves. So instead of just doing identification, you're doing inspection, measurement, guidance, all sorts of categorization that you can do within vision now instead of just the identification. Here's a bunch of pictures of different what we call labware. Labware is the consumable part in the healthcare industry. This is one of the many industries that sell a big, expensive piece of equipment, but the revenue stream really comes from the repeat business of selling the labware and the consumables year over year. And this shows a bunch of different ones. Lots of room and ideas for vision, lots of vision deployed out there. You can see in the upper right corner a system where you have many different racks with different types of vials and test tubes. You've got vision that will look and say, what kind of rack is it? What color is it? Where are there test tubes present? What color are the test tubes? Something I was unaware or oblivious to was that the type, the size of the test tube, the type of cap, the color of the cap, all mean what test the doctor wants them to run for that sample. So it all means something. Once you know that, then you can do classification of the test tubes and do various vision inspection based on that and automate those tasks as well. A lot of pick and place or robotic guidance with vision, so that you can see in the lower right where they're directing the arm to pick up the samples in question. And another one over here where they're detecting blood spots, the size, the measurement, where they're specifically located to control future steps in the process down the road. So a lot of different applications where vision can be used. I think the biggest thing I have at the bottom here, and this is where I'll jump in a little bit more, is there's a lot of good ideas out there, but you really need to understand what are their requirements up front. This is very serious market. You need to know what their true requirements are and know what test tubes are they going to see, what's the speed of these things flying through there that you need to be able to give results in. You need to know all the requirements up front to really make a robust system. Some of the challenges that we've seen and some of the questions we've either always asked or started to ask because of it are things like the lack of tight dimensional control. Of course, it's an instrument. It's pretty solid and understood what it is, but there's a lot of tolerances in there, and there's a lot of user intervention in putting stuff in there, and you need to be able to account for that. We often ask if there are system-level specifications available. We don't want to just know the vision system, the camera to the sample in question, but we want to know the whole environment that's going on. Where's lighting coming in? Is there a window? What things might affect the imaging? And we also ask if design changes are still an option. Oftentimes when they call someone in, they assume that you're going to place a camera in a certain location, but what if it's better to be closer or further apart based on the geometry of what we're trying to image itself? Another thing that is important here is that The system must exceed a 1 in 10,000 error rate, and you need to prove it before you put it into production. You need to have the data results available before you can even get 510(k) approval to market your product. Here we need to make sure we know every single use case. What are all your use cases, and what is the acceptance criteria for all of them so we can design a robust system. And then how do we know when we're done? These are long-term 3 to 5 year projects. How do we know when enough is good enough? And let's define that up front so that you're not dragging things out. You're not going to have a 100% failure-proof system. So when you do have a failure, it needs to fail safe. And that means that, well, I'll define that a little bit later, but you need to make sure you know what they expect a safe failure to be. What are the appropriate responses if there is a failure? How do they want the system to react? So the dimensional control, we've heard this a lot, but of course in a vision system, position tolerances are very important. You need to make sure that you have a robust method of locating your areas of interest, and you need to have consistent lighting and various other attributes to make sure that you can do color classification correctly, that you can do measurements correctly. Like with many other vision situations, you need a good calibration method. And this is interesting because this is something that you need to work with the instrument manufacturer on. They need to understand that you have to calibrate. Oftentimes they don't even know this. They don't know what that means. So you have to explain to them what needs to occur. In one situation, we have a customer that has an actual calibration fixture that they'll put in and calibrate at regular intervals. But that might not work for everyone because it adds cost and it adds complexity to the lab itself, to their customer. Another situation where we have like a calibration target label that's placed in the field of view that has different contrasting colors as well as shapes for measurements, and that works well. But again, another customer that can't use that because they need to do very strict cleaning methods within their instrument, and the material that would be needed for that label is very expensive. In that case, we came up with a way to actually make marks or holes within the sheet metal itself so that we could track to that mark, and that's how we're calibrating. So a lot of different methods to do it. You guys do many different types of calibration as well, but again, something that you really need to be working with that manufacturer on because it affects the design of their system, and they may have requirements that they didn't even think about. Another thing that I mentioned here, and it's sort of a recurring theme, is that they need to understand that any changes, no matter what it is, need to be tested, retested. In one case, we have retroreflective material behind the imaging plane, and the supply chain went out to get a lower cost retroreflective material. Fortunately, it didn't have the same properties, so our imaging started to look differently during validation testing, and it took us a really long time to figure out what was causing it because no one knew that that material had changed for a while. The second challenge I mentioned was system reliability. You need to understand the consequences of errors within the system. In this market, there are a lot of different consequences. Number one, the simplest and the least costly would be it throws an error and the lab tech has to go manually intervene, enter data, or test it themselves. That's not too bad, actually. That's the preferred type of error. Second would be a missed or incorrect test. An example here, when I had one of my sons, they do the foot prick where they collect blood to make sure that they have no diseases. We got a call about a week later that said that something happened with the sample or the test, and we had to come back and get the sample again. So that was time for 2 tests, 2 sample collections, time for me to take off, well, I wasn't working yet, but time for me to get to the hospital, and of course, anguish to have to collect that blood again from my newborn baby. So incorrect or mistesting, a bigger cost. Instrument damage. If you say something is a certain height and it's actually different, then you might have some collisions within the instrument and actually damage the instrument. And of course, misdiagnosis, although rare, is the most concerning, whether you're tying results to the wrong patient, or if the vision system itself is looking for 1, 2, 3 lines and actually making the diagnosis, then you really have to make sure that that system's robust. So once you understand the consequences of the errors and what errors they feel are best, then you can determine what the reliability is that they want and how do you design for it. You need to agree on who's responsible for each phase of testing. And as with many situations we've talked about over the last couple of days, you can't really test it without a large image set. And in this case, again, you need to test it before it's deployed, so you need those images being collected throughout the time. So image library is one of the solutions we have here, but it's not like you can go out to Google and just collect a huge image set. This image set is very specific. You need to talk with your customer or the manufacturer to understand who's responsible for collecting those images, who owns those images. In some cases, there might be some confidential information in them. How are you going to be doing data sharing of those images, timeline, cost, etc. Again, I mentioned knowing all the use cases. You need images, multiple images for every use case and all the error use cases that you can think of so that you can test it and make sure it's working appropriately. In a test tube sample, this might be where labels are too high or too low. There are standards for all of that. It could be that there's no sample in the window at all. It's just a blank picture. What do you do when that happens? It could be a cap on or off. It could be any sort of thing. And you need to make sure to collect these images from multiple smart cameras, multiple instruments, multiple users to have a wide variety of samples to be looking at. One of the things that has been discussed here, but we learned pretty early on, is the naming convention is super critical. How you're tagging and naming your images so that you can do some automated testing without having to open up the images every time. So defining that up front is very critical in this space because you've got different people collecting those images over different facilities and such. You need to make sure that they really understand what they're collecting and how they're naming them. One customer example that we're actively working on now, we are looking at test tubes. That's why I was mentioning some of those in the last samples. We're looking at the size, diameter, and height of the test tube, type of test tube, type of cap, the color, and all the label data. Right now we have about 70,000 images. We're expecting this to grow to 100,000 by the time we're done with V&V, and we've done all the testing. As I mentioned before, every change needs to be checked against this full image set. This includes any of our iterative vision system improvements to make sure we didn't break something else, as well as any customer design changes. And if you're making a customer design change, you then need to collect new images because you need images with that change shown in them. This process, every time we run through an iteration, takes greater than 24 hours. We're pushing all these images through the camera and making sure that we're not just testing the software, but we're also testing the hardware. And this project, we're well beyond a year, but these typically take 2, 3, 4 years to actually build. So they're not the situation where you're going to give them a solution in a month. Another thing we do when we're designing for system reliability is to make sure to design in features that will support this testing and iterative process. Again, we use smart cameras. They're programmed so that they can receive the images, not only by them taking them themselves, but being able to push the image library through from a PC. We also put custom code on the camera to check that the output is valid. What are all the different parameters that we're testing? And comparing that to a valid output. Before we send it out, it needs to at least be a valid output. We also have software on a PC that does this same thing, as well as additional software that would compare that output to the image name that we have defined, and making sure that we can do that all automated versus having someone manually go through this stuff. We use a lot of statistics and visualization methods, like many others do. One that we use, for example, for our color classification is to use a confusion matrix. make sure we're showing how each change affects the performance of that classifier. And here's a very simple example where it's just yes, no, what you expect it to be versus what it actually measured, and you're looking at false positives and false negatives. Our matrices are much larger, different types of test tubes and colors, and etc., and making sure we know which ones are okay to have a failure with and which ones are absolutely critical that we can't have any failures. The third challenge that I mentioned was this fail-safe design. We are in a lot of industrial automation applications, and in these cases, they want it to be as good as possible. If you're 50% confident, they want you to guess. They want to make sure that you're getting as much as you can with guesses. In healthcare, you can't guess. If you don't know even, 8% confidence, you're at 93% confidence, you need to give a no answer. I don't know. You need manual intervention. You don't want to give the wrong answer. I already mentioned, but you could have incorrect diagnostic testing that would occur if you said it was a red cap instead of the green cap that it actually was. You could waste time. You could lose time on some very, time-critical testing that needed to occur. And an example here is we try to, if we can define some of these use cases up front, then we can develop the algorithms in the vision system to start with the safe assumption so that we're not, so that we're reducing the potential of that. Again, an example with test tubes is a test tube, what happens is a pipette goes into the test tube and pulls out a sample for testing. If there's a cap on it, you're going to hit it and potentially damage the instrument. So in this case, we always assume that there's a cap on the test tube until the vision system can prove that there isn't a cap. And if we can't prove, have a lab technician come over and confirm it for you versus just guess and let the instrument have a concern. So some of the lessons learned, open communication up front, agreement on the design and the test strategy. This is sometimes awkward when you're trying to win the business of someone, but it's super critical to really understand what are the expectations, when do you know you're done, how long is this going to take, who owns the testing and development pieces of it. Again, document all possible use cases that you know of. If the scope increases, they say, oh, we decided to add this, this type of product. You need to revisit it and determine if additional design is needed. We have one situation where released product, they came back to us and said, the system isn't working, and we learned that they actually replaced the rack, a rack that holds multiple samples in it, with a new one, different color, and all the identifying features no longer there, and they didn't think that that would affect the vision system. So then they had to come back in an emergency back to us and help us, and we had to help them redesign the vision system based on that new scope that they had added. Define the workflow, again, for each use case, including the potential error situations so that you can design those out up front. Develop the naming convention, tagging convention early so that you can automate all of that analysis. And you really, in this environment, you need to run all these projects like they're a long-term project. Again, 3 to 5 years it takes to release a medical device typically. You're going to have milestones, you're going to have regular program meetings and reviews, you're going to have someone that's the project manager for that program and understand when testing will occur, when you're going to have some dry spells while they're waiting for hardware, etc. So with that, I have a couple resources in case anyone's interested in this market. I think you can get the slides sometime later, week or two, and open it up for any questions there might be.